All right, let's pray. Dear God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, and may we all be both teachers and learners in this time together. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. My name is Alyce McKenzie, and I am the Levan Professor of Preaching and Worship here at Perkins School of Theology, and another hat that I wear is I'm the director of the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence, which is a group that's 3 years old, that's devoted through peer groups and continuing education and mentoring to bring people's preaching to the next level, to transform the world. And the lecture that I'm offering this afternoon is entitled Share the Story, Shape the World, Storytelling as a Vehicle for Proclaiming the Good News. And I begin with the parable of truth and story. Once upon a time, Truth went about the streets as naked as the day he was born. As a result, no one would let him into their homes. Whenever people caught sight of him, they turned and they fled. And one day he was wandering sadly around when he came upon Story. Now Story was dressed in splendid, colorful clothing. And Story, seeing Truth, said, "Tell me, neighbor, what makes you look so sad?" Truth replied bitterly, "Oh, brother, things are bad, very bad. I'm old. I'm very old, and no one wants anything to do with me. People avoid me." Hearing that, Story said, well, Truth, people aren't running away from you because you're old. I am old. I'm very old. But the older that I get, the better people like me, and the more time they want to spend with me. People are avoiding you because you're naked. Please let me lend you some of my beautiful clothing, and then let's see if there's a different outcome. So Truth put on some of the beautiful, vivid garments of Story, and found then that the very people who avoided him and locked their doors to him invited him into their homes and welcomed him gladly. And from that time forth, Truth and Story have walked hand in hand. Now, my formal study of Story began perhaps by accident, maybe not. It was in a graduate degree program in 1990, and I was enrolled in a class, and the title was something like Interpreting Old Testament Genres for Contemporary Pulpits. And so on that morning, I was late. It wasn't really my kid's fault. I was just late. I had that little tick, that I get when I'm late. I'm trudging up the steps of Stewart Hall. Now, you know Stewart Hall. It's got this red stone on the red dark stone on the outside. And as you go in, you're just hit with the smell of lemon oil applied consistently for the past 150 years. And I was trudging up the stairs with my 12-pound portable computer, 1990. And I got into the class, and it was a bad day for me to be late because it was the day that they were handing out the clipboard to sign up for a 35-page paper on interpreting a genre of Old Testament for life today. And by the time I got there, someone had already purloined the Psalms, somebody had nabbed the narratives, and somebody had even lapped up the legal codes. You like that alliteration? I did that for you. So the lone genre that was left was, you guessed it maybe, Proverbs. A friend, well, I thought he had been a friend until that moment, Scott, leaned over and elbowed me, and he said, "Good luck getting a sermon out of a one-liner, McKenzie." But, as luck would have it, I went to the library right after class and found that Proverbs has the shortest bibliography of all the Old Testament genres. And then I got home that night and put my kids to bed, and I started reading through the Proverbs, which I discovered are not like these boring universal statements of truth, but they're these little nuggets that you're supposed to apply to specific situations that come out of specific situations. So I call them freeze-dried narratives. Short bibliography, really cool genre, win-win for me for being late. As one who grabs a passing dog by the ears, so is he who meddles in the quarrel of another. We've all done that. We've all been looking out our window and seen a Doberman going by, and we just go out and grab that sucker by the ears, don't we? A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And remember, these come out of specific situations, meant to be put back in. Listen to this one. There is a way. Proverbs 14:25. There is a way that appears right to a person, but its end is death. And then we turn to the sage Jesus, who has Proverbs as well. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. If anyone would save his life, he will lose it. And whoever loses his life for my sake in the Gospels will save it. Jesus found that out the hard way and now lives with us to empower us to live out that proverb as well. I expanded my vision then from the little proverb to the slightly longer, broader narrative form called the parable. There's one parable, at least, in the Old Testament, and it's in 2 Samuel 12, and it's when Nathan comes to David and says, there were two men in a certain city, one rich, one poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb. And perhaps you know how it goes. The rich man stole the poor man's ewe lamb, and David is incensed and said, the man that did this must die. And Nathan says, you're on this too. You are the man. A parable. Parables also played a big role in the rabbis' teachings in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai told this parable as a midrash on Leviticus 4:6. The rabbis used parables to explain existing scripture. And we'll see that Jesus used parables to crack open a window to see a new reality, the kingdom of God. But here's Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai's midrash parable on Leviticus 4:2, to make the point that many may suffer because of one. There was a group of people on a boat and in the water, and one man began drilling under his seat. His companions said to him, probably this is the cleaned up Bible version, why are you doing this? And he replied, what concern is this of yours? It's my seat. Parables were used by Rabbi Jesus to subvert the ritualistic, superficial religion of his day, to depict the picture of the kingdom in which love of God and love of neighbor were restored as the heart of the law. A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers. Listen, a sower went out to sow. So parables and proverbs were the sermon form of choice among the rabbis, and then as we move into the larger Jewish world, and continued to be the sermon form of choice until the gospel hit the Hellenistic Greek world. And then, I didn't believe this, but I looked into it, and it's true, then the form of choice became 3 points and a poem, basically. And it remained that in every century with some exceptions until about 1975. And in that movement, from the story being in the driver's seat to 3 points being in the driver's seat, story took a demotion. It was demoted from being the driving engine of the sermon, the main event, to the word is illustration, right? Illustrare, the Latin means to shed light upon. But the points are the main events. And then we have these little stories that we put in to shed light on the points. The thing is, the power of story is very persistent. And so maybe you've had this experience of experiencing a sermon that was a 3-point sermon, and you go home, and what do you remember? The story. Whichever of the stories was most compelling to you in all that was there. So story, it reminds me of a stubborn plant that cracks up through the concrete, no matter how many times they reseal it. So in 1975, a man named Fred Craddock, who was a young New Testament scholar, wrote a book called As One Without Authority. And he was reacting against what he regarded as the predictable, sort of static preaching, I said predictable, predictable, 1, 2, 3. static kind of preaching of a lot of white mainline churches and pastors. And his recommendation is put story back in the driver's seat. Have an emotional plot. Have a journey that you invite people on and take them using the principles of narrative that we've looked at in this class. So they start somewhere, they go somewhere, and you end somewhere. Rather than what I call loading people in the church van, driving them around on a flat surface for 20 minutes, and dropping them off again at the door. So Fred Craddock started this whole kind of revolution in preaching called the New Homiletic. And his assumption was, back in 1975, that people had the basic kind of Theology 101 and Bible 101 so that they could take these imaginative narratives, sermons, and apply them without a whole lot of directive. So we know that it's not 1975 anymore. And we can't really make that assumption, I don't think. But and the other thing is that we now have the 6 points and a PowerPoint sermon in place of the 3 points and a poem. So it's called the teaching sermon. So my contention is that even though people need to know their Bibles and they need teaching, they need truth, they still need story. Truth and story still need to go hand in hand. So I want to talk for a bit now about some reasons to employ story in our preaching. When I first started out, I was called to ministry in high school. Tried not to listen for many years, but it didn't work out too well, as you can tell. But my first appointment, the first church appointment, was the Page Roseland Charge near Aberdeen, North Carolina. I was the Duke student intern. And I was staying in Miss Mary Hoopert's unair-conditioned attic. That was compensated for somewhat by the fact that she was the best cook in the entire church. So that was also when I took up jogging to counteract the chocolate pie and the biscuits. Because eating is a ministry, isn't it, in the church? So Miss Mary Hoopert was my host. I had no idea what I was doing. I had never preached before. I had not been to seminary yet. And I had the Abingdon 1-volume commentary on the Bible, which has about this much on each book of the Bible. And so I'd write up this little Bible lesson. And I would go and inflict it on the hapless people of the Page Memorial Church, and then drive over quickly to the Roseland Charge and subject both of them to my little Bible lesson. But I learned the power of story by watching their faces, because they wanted to encourage the Duke intern, but after a while, their faces sort of glaze over, their eyes, and then I would think, oh, and I would pull out a story, and I would toss it out. Now, the problem was that it didn't necessarily relate to my point, but that didn't really seem to matter to me. So I began to call this form the forced march through the Siberian winter with periodic stops to hand out Snickers bars. So the first reason to employ story in preaching, as I could tell from the faces of people when I would tell a story, the first reason is because people have this anthropological compulsion to try and make a coherent narrative out of the sometimes disjointed events, episodic events of daily life. There's a series of children's books called Lemony Snicket, a series of unfortunate incidents, yes, or events. And in one of the books, the author says that life is like a weird restaurant with lots of odd little waiters who bring you things that you did not order and usually do not like. Well, I hope we can do better than that. I hope we can do better than that. But we are hardwired to try and make a significant and coherent narrative out of our events in our lives. In the 1970s, religion professor Stephen Kreitz wrote an article which he called The Narrative Quality of Experience. And here was his basic argument. The formal quality of experience through time is narrative. So using story taps into people's profound anthropological compulsion for story. So that's the first reason, an anthropological reason to use story. A couple summers ago, I attended the National Storytellers Network annual conference in Phoenix in July. I think it was in Phoenix because probably in July hotel rates are pretty cheap. because it was like 110 degrees. But despite that, I heard a lot of people exercising their anthropological compulsion to make story of their lives. I heard Jay Gilliland, who was a storyteller from New England, tell about an incident of picking blueberries with his daughter and the joys of being a father late in life. I heard Connie Reagan Blake tell of shopping for coffins with her mother and how her mother insisted that the lining of the coffin matched the outfit that she had chosen to wear in the afterlife. There was this amusing conversation about whether a certain outfit would be too formal for the afterlife, whether a certain other outfit might be too bright or perhaps too hot. So Connie told that story about her mother. And then Elaine Murray told the myth of Athena and Arachne. And Arachne was the mortal master weaver whom Athena, in a fit of jealousy, turned into a spider. She told it with a cape that she flipped around and very dramatic, and I just really was mesmerized by her storytelling. And then Doug Lippman told the story of his mother, who was Christian, and his father, who was Jewish. And she made sure that, as well as, in addition to there being a tree in the front room, that there was always a menorah in the front window every holiday season. And he, as a child, he thought, oh, that menorah is so tacky, it's plastic, and why do we have to have that? And his mother said to him, Doug, the menorah is in the window to show to everyone that passes by that a Jew lives here. Lynn Ford told Appalachian tales from the African-American Appalachian tradition of her youth. So I encourage all of you, and I strive for this myself, to harness the anthropological compulsion for story among those who will listen to our sermons, and to train our eye on our inner life, on, like we've been doing in class, on contemporary life, on the Bible, on history, for all those wonderful stories that can help us and our listeners make sense of their daily lives in difficult times. The reason that we tell stories is, or a reason that it's more important now than ever for us to hone our storytelling skills, is because the stakes are very high. The stakes are very high. With the ubiquity of handheld devices, people now actually sort of have the ability to be more than one place at one time and to be never fully one place at any one time. And there is something that cultural analysts have baptized CPA, and it stands for continuous partial attention. Continuous partial attention. So to gain and maintain people's attention so they retain something, I think is more difficult now than perhaps ever. The stakes are high because we preach to people who are used to really, really vivid storytelling. People can now binge watch Breaking Bad, Mr. Robot, The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, Sherlock, Billions, This Is Us, insert your favorite binge habit. Because these storytellers, across the narrative arc of a season and multiple seasons, if they get renewed, these storytellers know how to take advantage of the key elements we've been talking about in class. The elements of drama, the inciting incident, the turns, the denouement. They know how to do it. And when our listeners are exposed to that, I think it ups the ante even more for us. So we can learn from them the power of story. Now, their stories are wonderful, but we have a story with a capital S. We have a sacred story. And I would remind myself and all of us that if the tech goes out, if the power in the building goes out, I have no PowerPoint, that I, the preacher, still can stand as a spellbound and spellbinding sharer of the sacred story, resting in the power of story. So, anthropological reason to tell stories. People love and need stories. There's also then a biblical reason to tell stories in our sermons. Clearly, the Bible has many different rhetorical genres. There are proverbs, there are parables, there are legal codes, there are epistles, there are apocryphal texts, there are poems in the Psalms. But a lot of the Bible is story, narrative. And every one of these rhetorical genres I mentioned have their own purpose. They want to not just say something, but they want to do something, have some kind of impact. And the rhetorical function of narrative is to cause us to identify with some character in the story, to enter into the story, to embark upon it, that journey with the character, and undergo the same kind of change that that character undergoes. And so in our preaching, it stands to reason on story that that would be a noble and valid purpose. Invite people in, have them go with us through the journey, and emerge with us different somehow. I know a British pastor, and when people go out the door at the back, he got tired of hearing them say, thank you for the message, good message, enjoyed your message. And he began holding on to their hand, kind of tightly, and saying to them, thank you, but what is different for you now? And that'd be a little awkward, wouldn't it, if you hadn't been listening to the sermon? And he wouldn't give the hand back until they had something to say. So there's an anthropological reason, there's a biblical reason, there's a communicational reason. It's really what we've been looking at all semester about the dynamics of narrative and how they're deeply embedded in our human psyche. And they're deeply satisfying, and they can be deeply disturbing when we need to be disturbed. So I was thinking about having T-shirts made up, but I was afraid you would be bored by this logo. But it would say this: a clear structure is the best friend of memory. How about that? I don't know how many T-shirts we'd sell, but it's true. When you've got your clear, dynamic structure, you don't necessarily need to have everything written down for you. I say as I look down at my notes, right? Now, so anthropological, biblical, communicational, and then theological. There's a theological reason, because the whole sweep of the Bible story is creation, redemption. No, creation, I always forget fall. Creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. And I believe that you could say that our calling as preachers is because for many people, and perhaps for some of us at certain times in our lives, the story is just this: creation, fall. And that's where we're left. So our vocation is to invite people into a larger, broader narrative sweep, a four-part rather than a two-part. About 30 years ago, David Buttrick, who is now in his probably late 80s, wrote a book called Homiletic: Moves and Structures. And in that book, he talked about the fact that he believed that the Bible story was this master story, this large, overarching, sacred story. And he said one time in a talk, paraphrasing him, he said, you know, our role as preachers is to invite people into this master story out of their, you know, whatever little shrunken, shriveled, self-centered story they're writing at the time. He says it's an invitation to place our little lives in the context of this big and beautiful story that has a much better opening and a whole hell of a lot better ending than the one that we are currently working on by ourselves. Once upon a time, Truth walked about the streets. And Truth was naked as the day he was born. And as a result, no one would give him the time of day. They avoided him and ran inside whenever they caught sight of him. But one day he was wandering around sadly, and he came upon Story. Now Story was dressed in beautiful, vivid, colorful clothes, shiny clothes. And Story, seeing Truth, said to Truth, "Tell me, neighbor, what makes you look so sad?" Truth replied, "Ah, brother, I am old. And because I'm so old, no one will give me the time of day." Hearing that, Story said, "People aren't avoiding you because you're old. I hate to break it to you, because look at me. I'm old, getting older. The older I get, the more they love me. People are avoiding you, just between us, because you're naked. So please allow me to lend you some of my beautiful raiments, and let's see if the response is different." So Truth took Story's advice, put on Story's borrowed clothing. And from that time on, Truth and Story have walked hand in hand. Now, we've talked about how one way to begin a story is to jump into the middle. And so when you do that, then you let people figure out what's going on in the story. So I thought that I would tell you a story now and trust you to figure out who you are and where we are in the story. Are you ready? It is a joy to see so many of you here this afternoon. We had to run off 3 times as many bulletins as we had planned, and we set up 3 times as many chairs. There's no time for us to run out and buy more cookies, so you all are going to have to work that whole thing out at the end of the service at the back. But this gives a lie to the widely held belief that if you want to have a big funeral, you have to die young. 12 years ago, I was spending a week with my mother at Chautauqua, which is a cultural center and camp in the wilds of upper New York State. My dad had died a few years before, and as many of you know, this had been one of their favorite places to go each summer. We were keeping the family tradition alive. So that July morning, we got up, my mom and I, we made our coffee. She got her daily Chautauquan newspaper under one arm, she had her seat pad under the other, and she led the way to the amphitheater so that we could hear the preacher of the morning. We got over there to the amphitheater, we slide down the wooden bench, and I go to sit next to her, and she says, oh no, she says, move over. I said, well, what? She says, I'm saving a place for Bruce. I'm like, who's Bruce? Bruce, I haven't heard about Bruce. She said, he's a friend of mine from New Cumberland, which is the town where I grew up. All right, fine. So I soon found out that Bruce was a dapper, retired school teacher, then principal, then superintendent, a few years older than Mom, with a wicked sense of humor, and this penchant for drawing other people out rather than talking about himself. So he would ask these Bill Moyer-esque questions, like this. As we're sitting next to each other eating ice cream later, so Alyce, you're here for a week. Tell me, what do you hope to gain as a person from this experience? I'm just like, and here's a kicker. So Alyce, later in the same day, what would you hope would be the legacy of your teaching and your preaching as you look back 5, maybe 10 years from now? I'm thinking, I'm just eating my ice cream cone, you know? These questions are too heavy for vacation. But it seemed like he was more interested in drawing other people out than he ever was in revealing anything about himself. The only thing more interesting to Bruce than drawing other people out appeared to be my mother. And who can blame him? Lovely lady that she is. I had the privilege of performing their wedding service several months later. And over the next 10 years, got to know Bruce, along with my siblings, as a delightful part of our family, who loved our mother and enjoyed the daily rituals of life here at Bethany Village, except he did not enjoy the exercise classes. In the exercise room, the clock was over on this wall, and the young teacher would tease him and say, Bruce, my yoga class is really good exercise for the left side of your neck, because you spend the whole time watching the clock. He was outspoken in his politics, a founding member of WITF in Harrisburg. Every evening, he serenaded my mother with piano music from the sunroom while she made dinner. He often spoke of how grateful he was that they had found each other after both of their long-term spouses had passed away. Over a 10-year period, with determined effort, I succeeded in drawing him out and finding out about him. And a picture emerged of a man who was always a gracious, witty host, even when all these children filled his home with noise and laughter. A man who was, as a child, an earnest, hardworking little boy in New Cumberland, Pennsylvania, which is a little river town of about 10,000 people on the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. He would borrow his neighbor's dog, Andy, and every Saturday morning he would fill a basket with donuts, and Andy would hold a donut basket in his teeth and run along after him, and he would sell the donuts door to door. He admitted that there's a picture that proves this. He admitted that one Saturday morning as they were running, Andy dropped the donut basket and the donuts fell all over the baseball field. And Bruce looked around to see if anyone was watching, picked the donuts up, brushed them off, and sold them door to door. I got a picture of Bruce as a disciplined student, first at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then getting his master's degree at Penn every Saturday for 3 years. And as a Navy sonar expert, Bruce hated water, and he detested swimming. But when called upon, he was willing to serve in the Navy when his country needed him, and possibly diverted a German subfleet from his destroyer when he was on duty at the sonar station. I got a picture of him as a strict school teacher, principal, and superintendent. And as one who, though he never had any children of his own, had a lot of children, and one who raised his nephew, Steve and Linda, when his brother, who was an alcoholic, married to second wife Lila, who was an unstable person, were raising Steve and Linda. And he told the story, after I really had to pull this out of him, but he told the story of the night when Steve and Linda were 14 and 12. They lived about 1.5 miles across the bridge down the road. And they appeared at his doorstep at like 10 o'clock at night in the rain. It was one of those pounding rains, in their pajamas. And he opened the door, and Steve says, "Uncle Bruce, can we come and live with you?" And Linda said, "Lila just threatened us both with a knife." And as I heard that story, my sort of heart went out to Lila, because I would not want to be Lila the next day when Bruce came to call. There was always something of the school principal aura about Bruce. Stand up straight, suck in your stomach. When I was still a member of the Central Pennsylvania Conference that met at Grantham College, at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania, I would stay with Bruce and my mom for several days every June. And I still remember the time when I came down to go to a meeting, and I was dressed in like a knee length, or maybe even a little below the knee length skirt. It was a suit and a short sleeve, because it was summer, tailored top, right? And Bruce looks up from his paper and he says, "Is that what you're wearing?" And immediately I'm like taken back to being in the school principal's office at age 15. And of course I said, well, what's wrong with it? And he said, "I'm just not used to seeing a professional woman showing her arms in public like that. So you see, Bruce?" The only person to ever attend their own funeral, to my knowledge, was Tom Sawyer, who hid in the eaves and listened to his own funeral sermon, and while Aunt Polly just emoted about what a good boy he'd been, right? The whole reason, however, that we are gathered here this afternoon is because Bruce is not seated in our midst. But if he were, here is what I would want to say to him. I would want to say, "Thank you, Bruce, for being the crusty, gracious, generous, wicked-witted man you are. Thank you for the gift of your presence in my mom's life and in our family." And I would want to say, let's give credit where credit is due. Thanks be to God, the creator of life, who gave us the company of Bruce, even for this brief time in our earthly walk. I have a feeling that on July 22nd, when Bruce Connor moved from this life to the next, he heard somebody saying, "I'm saving a seat for Bruce." Now, what I offered just now came about in the following way, which I think has some relevance for our work together. I was sitting drinking coffee on my sister's patio the morning of Bruce's service. I got a call from the chaplain at Bethany Village, Retirement Village in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, where his service was to be. At 11 in the morning, his service was to be a few hours later. And he said, "Alyce, this is Brad Eaton. I am in tremendous pain from a torn meniscus. I'm on my way to the orthopedic surgeon. My associate will read the text and preach a brief funeral sermon, but will you do the eulogy?" So I sat at my sister's picnic table, drank my coffee, and started listing all of his qualities: hardworking, witty, opinionated, inquisitive. And as I did that, I thought, my energy just ebbed. I just had a list. A eulogy is one person's experience of someone that we hope will open up that person's life to those present, to contribute to their experience, and to enable somebody who didn't know the person to know them a little bit better. And so I thought, maybe rather than a list of qualities, I should tell a story about how I came to know Bruce. I first met him when he sat next to my mother at an amphitheater at Chautauqua. And that was kind of strange because, and then it kind of rolled out from there. After the service, my older brother, Wade, who is a journalist and has written a couple of novels, came up to me and he said, I really liked the lead-in and then how you circled back to it at the end. How did you come on that? What was your creative process? Did you plan that as the end and then work toward it? Or did it come to you late in the process? And so we talked a little bit about that. You always want to pretend that you did something on purpose if it worked. But I remembered the advice of novelist John Irving, who gave a lecture to a preaching class here several years ago. He said, begin with the ending and then work toward it, relentlessly. And I remembered the advice of another colleague who teaches at St. Paul's School of Theology in Overland Park, Kansas. He said, put the second most interesting moving part of your sermon first, and the most interesting moving part last. What I do know is that when we preach, we can list the qualities of God, or we can tell the story of how we came to know God, how God introduced God's self to us, so that those who have never met God might come away from the sermon feeling that they know God a little bit better and perhaps wish that they would have the chance to get to know God even better. 19th century Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon once said that most sermons that he heard were like somebody giving a lecture on medicine to a group of sick people. Why tell stories in our sermons? There's an anthropological reason. We're hardwired for story. There's a communicational reason. The dynamics of story invite us in and lead us to a conclusion and transformation. There's a biblical reason because much of the Bible is story. And there's a theological reason because God's salvation story is the story. So let's share our story. Let's share the story with the world because in every sermon, we're called upon to tell the story and to tell it well. And in every sermon, I believe that story needs truth, but truth also needs story. Thank you.